Hello everybody. In this video, we're going to learn how to use JavaFX to create tables. We'll be learning how to use a new class called the TableView class and some associated classes. For instance, connecting the table to a list, which when it's updated, the table updates automatically. So we'll also learn about a new class called observable list. We'll create some basic tables, and once we're done with that, we'll also create some interactive tables as well, meaning tables that do more than just display lists, tables on which you can edit lists as well. All right, to begin, I've got my standard template file extending the application class in JavaFX. I'll call this class table example. And as always, I have a public static void main, where I'm going to launch the application, catch exceptions, and then exit. And also, as usual, I have a start method. And applications must implement the start method, which takes a main stage as a parameter. I'll start off by setting the title of the window, maybe table examples. I always like to use a border pane for my layout manager. I will attach a scene here. While we're at it, let's also increase the font size just so it'll be a little bit easier for you to read. Let's say root.setStyle. You could add a style sheet into this, but since I don't have one of those prepared, I'll just use the CSS code FX font size, maybe increase that to size 20. And typically this would be a string inside the font file. Sorry, not inside the font file, inside the style sheet file. But for now, we'll add that style manually. We've got our main scene, and we're gonna start adding some code in here. And once we've entered our custom code, of course, at the very end, we must always remember to show the stage, to open the window and display what we've written. To start off, we want to create a table that displays some kind of information, and that information is going to be contained in a second class. So to begin, I'm going to create a simple class, maybe that will store information for a person. So I'll create a new class called person, and public class person. And let's say that a person contains two pieces of information. And let's see, I'm going to make these private. Private string name and private int age. I need a constructor. So let's create a person taking in a string n and an int a. And we'll assign those values. So this dot name equals n and this dot age equals a. All right, it's going to be very important to create set and get methods. So I need to have ways to access and change these two values of name and age. Right, and this is going to be very important to work in concert with some of the JavaFX classes that we'll see a little bit later. So first, I'm going to go ahead and create set and get methods for the name variable. So let's say public void set name takes in a string n, and as you may have guessed, we'll just say this dot name equals n. To get the name, that returns a string. We'll just return this dot name. We also need setters and getters for the age. So let's create public void set age. Takes in an integer a. We'll say this dot age equals a. And finally, we need to be able to get the name. So let's say public int get age, int a, and we'll return this dot age. Right, there we have it, a very basic class to store, set, and get values for a name and age of a person. Next, I'm going to head back to the table example class. Now I'm really ready to start adding some of this custom code. So first, I'm going to create a table view object. And I need to be able to specify what kind of data I'm going to store in my table view, kind of like you would with a list. This table view is going to store person data. I'll call this table equals a new table view object storing person data. The next object I want to create is a list which also stores person data. This is going to be a special kind of list, not just an array list, but this is going to be a list which listens for changes in its contents, and when the contents of the list change, it will update any viewer which is connected to it, as we'll see soon. So this class is called an observable list, and similar to the table, this is going to store person data, and I'll just call this maybe data list equals. The way you initialize this is actually using a static method in a helper class called fx collections. I'd like to run the method observable array list. Right. And again, this is just creating an array list with a little bit of extra functionality added to it, which will come in helpful. Next, I'd like to link together the table and the data list. And I do that by saying table.setItems to data list. So now, whenever the contents of the data list change, the table will change as well. So far, we've initialized a table to display data. Next, we've initialized an array list that triggers events when contents change. And finally, we've linked together the table and the data list. Table and list. All right, next I want to specify the way the table looks. Tables don't have to display, or rather table views don't have to display all the information associated to this object. In our case, we will display all that information. But what we're going to do now is create columns to display select information from list objects. And these are called table columns. So I'm going to create a table column. I'll call this first one the name column. That will be a new table column. And inside the constructor, it's going to take a single string, which is the word which will be displayed at the top of that column. In this case, I want to display the string name. Again, this doesn't actually have to correspond to the name of a field in the person class. It's the thing you want displayed at the top of the column, the text you'd like up there. So you create a column. We can also change the width of the column. At least I'm going to change the preferred width. So we can still resize it later. We're not setting a minimum or maximum width, but a suggested starting width, let's say 100 pixels. And finally, this last line of code is a little bit long, but I like to think of it as explaining how to extract data from the person object to display inside the column. So the way we do this is the following code: name column dot set cell value factory. Right? So the cells are the individual rectangles within the table, and the value factory, think of that as something which will produce the methods which are stored in there. All right, what we're going to do here is the values we're going to display are properties or values stored within an object. So I'm going to create a new property value factory. And this is extracting from a person object some string data corresponding to the variable called name. Right, there's a lot to unpack here. Again, from the person class, there's a field called name. And so this property value factory is going to look for the getName and setName methods, which return strings, and that data will be extracted and placed in the column. All right, similarly, I'd like to do the same thing for age. So I'm going to start off by maybe copy pasting these lines of code and then making some small changes. Instead of the name column, right, maybe I'll change this to age column. I'll put the text age at the top of that column. The age column, I'll also have it store the same preferred width. And then how do I extract data here? Well, for the age column, right, the way I'm going to extract this, I'm extracting a value from a person. In this case, I'm getting an integer. I can't say int when I'm using a generically typed variable. I actually need a class name, so I need to actually say integer. So it's an integer of a person, and the field name is age. All right, very good. So now we've set up the table columns that explains how we're going to extract information from the person objects in the list, which is linked to this table. Next, I've set up the columns. I kind of need to place the columns inside the table. So next we'll add columns to table with the following bit of code. We'll say table.getColumns. That returns a list of columns, and we're going to add all the following columns to it all at the same time. We're going to add name column followed by age column. All right, so we've added the columns to the table. The last thing we need to do, remember everything needs to be linked together. We've set up a table, but we never in fact actually added the table to our stage yet, or to the root element in the stage. So we also always need to remember to add the table to the root element. We used a border pane for the root, so I'll say set center as table. Right, that should be all the code that we're going to need. There's a lot going on. Let's go ahead and close this. Then I'll right click and run the main method. Excellent, so we have a table. Right now we have a name and an age, and as it says, there is no content in table. All right, so I'm going to go back to the code and actually add some content. I'll add a few people to the table. And remember, we do this indirectly by adding it to the list. Right, so data list.add, as you would for a normal list, and add a new person object. Maybe I'll add a person, I don't know, named Lee, who's 40 years old. And let's add another. Let's say maybe data list dot add a new person. Let's add Dan, who is 37. And maybe let's say data list dot add a new person named Chris, who is 33. Right, so I'm creating new person objects and adding them to the data list. The data list is linked to the table, and it's an observable list. So every time the contents of data list change, for instance, by adding new items to it, then the table view will automatically update to display that data. All right, so let's go ahead and compile. And let's give this a run. Hopefully we'll see a window which actually has some content in it. So I see Lee and Dan and Chris. I don't see any ages. That might be because in the person class, I think what I should do is I should, instead of using int, let's try using integer. Let's actually use classes here. All right, because getAge doesn't really return an integer, it really returns an int. Oh, and you know what else? GetAge isn't going to work because it doesn't take in an int. So I'm not sure if I actually needed to change this to an integer, but I certainly needed to change getAge method. All right, recompile the person class. Hopefully getAge will work properly, so that for the table example, I should see a list of names and ages. And sure enough, there we have it. And these tables can do many of the things that you would expect with a table. I can resize the columns. And you can also click on a column to sort it in ascending or descending order. Right, for strings, it'll sort it alphabetically. And similarly for numbers, it'll sort it numerically. There we go. We've got a very basic table. I'm going to create some additional functionality. The next thing I'd like to do is make the table editable. Right, you might notice if I right-click and then run this program, one thing that this application does not do, which we might expect from common spreadsheet applications, if I double-click on any one of these entries, I can't actually change the values in here. Right, so let's go back into the table example class. And after adding these three people, I'd like to next add interactive functionality. In other words, I'd like editable table cells. So the first thing I need to do is table.setEditable to true. It would be great if this was all there was to it, but there is actually a lot more to add. So first, I have to do this column by column, and I'll start with a name column. I'm going to use a method called setCellFactory. When you double-click on the cell of a table, basically you want a text field to appear. So here I'm going to create a text field, table cell, which will appear in that table column. Right, so now, whenever we double-click on a table, well, a little text field will appear. But finally, we have to say, what happens when we actually change the data in that particular cell? Right, so again, this line of code causes a text field to appear when editing. And finally, I need to say what to do after new data is entered by changing the data and then pressing enter. So again, I'm working the name column. I'm going to set on edit commit. Right, so this is basically code that's going to run after we press enter in that column. To express the code that's going to be run, I need to use something called a lambda expression, or I'm going to choose to use something called a lambda expression. This takes in a cell edit event. Right? The row is represented by a person, but we're editing some string data. Right, so those are the inputs. And then the arrow points to the code that will be run once we enter new data. And so what do we want to happen? Let's see, we would like to say first we want to extract the data. So I'll say person data item is equal to, from this event, I'd like to get the row value, and each row in the table corresponds to a person. Right. Second, I'd like to get the name that was entered, and that's entered as a string. We're extracting the name from this object. So let's say string name equals, no, we're not extracting the name from the object, excuse me. From the event that was triggered, we're going to get to the value that was entered. So we'll say event.get new value. And then we're going to change in that particular data item, we're going to set the name to be that new name that was entered. That new name that was entered changes the contents of data item. And since it is an observable list, that will also cause the view to update with that new information. Let's see, what else do we have here? Name column set on edit commit. Okay, so the reason I'm not able to do this particular edit event, right, the incompatible parameter types in the Lambda expression, I need to also associate these types to the column as well, which I don't think I did. Just for displaying data, you wouldn't need to do this. But I'm going to create a table column, right? So here in this line of code, a table column takes the string from a person object. So I'm just changing the declaration up here. Table column, person, comma, string. All right, so now when I do an edit event on the table column, these types are associated to it. And hopefully that will fix the error down here. Sure enough, this compiles all right. Let's go ahead and give this program a run and see what happens. All right, so again, I can change this information. And if I double click on one of these, text editor appears, and I could change the name here. Very good. Double clicking the age column won't change anything yet because I have to set up similar functionality for that. And we'll see how to do that next. It's a little bit different because it's an integer value, and text fields return strings by default, which makes sense because that's what text fields do. But if we want to be able to edit the age values or numeric values, we need a little bit more in our code. So heading back to the table example, the first thing I'm going to do, which I should have remembered to do from before, let's see. Right, the next thing I'd like to do is kind of repeat this process. I've added interactive functionality by setting the cell factory on edit commit. I'd like to do the same thing for the age column. And so if I go up to the age column, I need to do the same thing I did when declaring the name column. I'd also like to add in some type information. So this table column takes the integer data from a person. And so associating the types with it. All right, and now I'm going to do something very similar to what we did before. I'd like to say age column dot set cell factory, and this is going to be again text field table cell dot for table column. But in addition to setting up a text field, I'm also going to build in a converter which will take that string data and immediately convert it to a number. So there's a parameter I can pass into this method for table column. I'm going to say new number string converter. All right. The next bit of code I need to add is, again, what to do when new data is entered. Right, so again, I'm going to say age column set on edit commit. Right? When we edit commit, it creates a cell edit event, which takes a person, in this case, integer data. Actually, no, in general, this is going to take in number data, right? We have a number string converter. It's converting a string object to a number object. This is taking a person and extracting number data. So again, I'm creating a Lambda expression. The code that I would like to run this time, let's see, before person data item, let's get the piece of data which is associated to the row. And then we're going to get a number because of the number string converter. Number, I'll call this num at first. Event.getNewValue. And finally, I'd like to convert that to an integer. Right, so let's say integer age is equal to num dot int value. Right, it converts a number to an integer type. And now I can say data item dot set age to whatever this new age is. All right, and that's the code I want to run when we do an edit commit. So I can close that up. Oh, looks like I forgot something here. Let's see, text field table cell for table column. See, a new number string converter. Let's see, what am I forgetting here? Let's see, the error is inferred type. Let's see, oh, this is a number string converter. When I set up the age column, did I make, for this age column, I really want this to be person, comma, number. Right, that's the inferred type. All right. And this also needs to be maybe person, number. You need to be consistent. All right. Class now compiles. I've changed the settings in the table column since that stores a general number. Let's go ahead and give this a run and see if we can change the values being stored in the table. All right, so as before, I've got a table with 2 columns. I should still be able to change the text in here, but also, can I change these numbers? Sure enough, and every time I double click, it'll create a text field, and in the age column, whatever text we entered is being converted from a string to a number. Then we change that to an int. There we go. Everything's looking fantastic. And that is how you set up an editable table in JavaFX.